So this week we're actually getting into a little more of the details of the skills of communication. So we've gone through some of the mindfulness-based skills of self-awareness that sort of prepare you to entering into dialogue with people within which you might use some of these skills of communication. Today we're focusing specifically on active listening. It's a way of listening that maintains an engaged stance as the listener, as opposed to just being the passive recipient of sound that the other is sending your way. So we talked a little last week about the different models or ideas of how we can understand communication. A linear communication would be absent of active listening, for example, where you, the speaker, are sending messages to me, the listener, and I'm just taking it or accepting it without any feedback at all, or without any information exchange between the two of us. That's more than one way. So elements of active listening that I've mentioned on the PowerPoint, basically active listening can be thought of as a listening with as opposed to a listening about. So a listening with is that we are both engaged and present in the conversation, and I'm listening to you listen to yourself explain what it is that's in your inner world in a sense, as opposed to me, a distant observer, watching in on what I can perceive about you. So that listening with stance changes how I, the listener, then engage with you and feel about what I'm listening to or what I'm hearing about. Active listening is, however, taking on the other's frame of reference. So it's less of me and more of you, but that's done so in an active way. Good listening is active in that in that I'm engaged and involved in the listening process, and that's evident to you, who is the speaker. But there's less of me involved, which somewhat means like I'm not taking action, I'm not yet responding, I'm not putting my own thought, my own intention, my own hope into the conversation quite yet. We're going to talk about when listening becomes more about responding, and that shift happens. And we'll spend more time next week talking about what that looks like. But you can think of active listening as setting yourself aside and taking the other's frame of reference. That means taking the other's point of view, taking the other's perspective to the best that you can. It's worth noting that there are several things involved in active listening. It's not just taking in information that you can use, that you can understand and use. It has cognitive aspects of it, so ways of understanding intellectually. It has affective components which have to do with empathy and emotion, so those are very present there. And it has behavioral aspects. Behavioral in this case just simply means things that you see and hear me do, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that I act in a way that's responsive to what you're saying, in any way that is my own idea or my own direction, but it is more, it does have to do with changing things about how you see and hear me. Tone of voice, facial expression, things like that. We'll get to that. So one model of how to understand active listening, it's important to recognize that something like active listening is a process that you'll have to find ways to fit you specifically. So these elements are some that I've found to be extremely helpful. They're a popular way of thinking about active listening. They're often used to describe the process of active listening, so we're going to go through it, but you'll have to find ways that it fits you, so you'll alter your understanding of these things as we go along. But basically the 5 elements: pay attention, demonstrate that attention, defer judgment, provide feedback, and respond appropriately. And we're going to go through these one by one. So pay attention is sometimes maybe overlooked. Okay, I'm paying attention to you. I'm looking at you. I hear you. Those basic surface parts of paying attention are required, but paying attention is a kind of inner game. Paying attention is an inward stance of interest, of engagement, of openness, of intention, and that is something that goes on within you. And a listener, a speaker is, I think, usually very clear on whether the listener that they're speaking to is authentically present. And so bringing an authentic presence, bringing your attention authentically to a conversation, it's not something always easy to do. If you're talking with someone that you feel is difficult to speak with, if you're talking about things that are difficult to talk about, or if there's a lot of disagreement, for instance, or if there's a lot of uncertainty or lack of clarity, then being authentically present can be challenging. But it's something that is an inward stance, so an attitude of how I come to a conversation. It's not just how I appear to come to the conversation. The second aspect is demonstrate that attention. So this is where you cultivate that inward attitude of paying attention authentically, openly, in an engaged and interested way the best you can. And then you show the speaker that you're there with them. It highlights your presence. It highlights the fact that you're as engaged and involved with what they're saying as possible. One simple way to understand how to do that is to go down the list of nonverbals. So eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures of your hands, things like that. And those overlap in the way that you send and receive messages. But as a listener, your facial expression, your eyes, your posture, and things like that are all really clear signals about where you are. And if you're there with them, present with them, then they're going to feel that and likely respond to it in a more or less positive way. There have been studies showing that when people are attuned in conversation together, they tend to mirror one another unconsciously. But you can do that intentionally and consciously. So the way one's legs are crossed, for instance, if you're crossing your legs in the direction toward the person, that can be a subtle signal that you're more engaged with what they're saying. If you lean into parts of their descriptions of what they're talking about that seem to be highlighted, then they know. If their facial expression changes, if they're giving you more of an open expression or a down or sad expression, you're mirroring that in your own facial expression. Actually helps them clarify what they're feeling as they're talking. And that's really helpful for getting you the clearest message. The use of silence is something that's often overlooked in certain types of conversations. Giving people space, conversational space, to formulate their thoughts and then express it clearly to you can be a wonderful gift to give someone, rather than feeling that silence coming and feeling it awkwardly and then trying to quickly fill silence. Your job as the active listener would be to give full permission for that silence to be there, so that they can then construct their own thought and then clearly deliver what it is that they'd like you to hear. That silence is something that may have to be practiced, because it sometimes does feel awkward. But experiment with it in your own life, adding an extra 1 or 2 seconds. That's all sometimes it takes. You'll feel the tug of awkwardness, but kind of stay with it and see what it's like. Silence doesn't mean they ask you a question and you stand there blankly staring at them in silence. That's not what that means. If they've not directly asked you to respond, and it's not quite time for you to respond, giving them the space to work with their own thoughts is what silence is about. So experiment with that some on your own. A really simple way to show you're present, to demonstrate your attention, are the kind of subvocal slight responses. Mm-hmm, or yes, or okay, or something like that. Just simply means I hear you and I'm still here with you paying attention. The third component, deferring judgment, means to suspend your evaluation of the person and what they're saying. That falls in line with one of the facets of mindfulness we've discussed already. But I want to really specifically outline what I think deferring judgment could mean, and I'm just going to read it off the slide. So that's where I'm getting this. It refers to what's called unconditional positive regard. So unconditional positive regard does not mean to assume everything the other does is good. It means to assume everything the other does, given their unique experience of life from their unique perspective of it, makes sense and is a result of their attempt to move in a positive direction. In other words, toward the better for them and people around them, according to what meaning they have found in their experience. This is a way of understanding that how a person responds to things in life makes sense even if it's not helpful. So even if it's reactive and even if it's difficult to work with, one can understand that it might make sense given their unique perspective on the life that they live and how they've made sense of the life that they're living. And with the underlying assumption, and it is an assumption, but one that's probably helpful to have, the assumption that everyone is basically trying their best. That's one way of thinking about it. That not everyone acts their best way, but the assumption that everyone's intention is to try to improve their life based on what they're doing is one that's worth attempting to have for others. And if you hold that assumption toward others, it's a lot easier to suspend judgment about them as you're interacting with them. The fourth element is providing feedback. So I want to make sure to clarify what I mean by feedback here. Feedback does not mean formally responding to the other person after they've completed speaking. Okay, that's something that we'll talk about next week of how to respond appropriately. Providing feedback basically allows them to know that you've received what you think is their clear message. Ways of doing that, I feel three of the most important are restatements, reflections, and validations. So restatements basically serve the function of summarizing and clarifying, and sometimes to highlight really important things that you've heard. The reason that we're providing feedback is so that the speaker can see and hear that you've been with them and you've been retaining as a result of your interest in what they've said. It can be thought to be two types of restatement. One is to clarify for you, the listener, and the other is to clarify for them, the speaker. Sometimes restating what the person says is helpful for them to hear what they've said and to make sure it's accurate and to help them clarify it for themselves so that they can describe it then more clearly. And there can be thought of as four types of restatements. One is literal and exact, so literally saying exactly what the person said. If a person said it was really hard on the family, whatever they're describing their situation, and you, the listener, reply with maybe some nonverbals, wow, it was really hard on the family. Saying it back to them at the right time. You don't use this all the time, but it can be powerfully used in the right moment. Second type is like the first, but you basically change the pronoun. So, taking the previous example, it was really hard on my family, if the speaker says that, and you restate it to them with this second type. Wow, it was really hard on your family. Just saying exactly what they said, but changing the pronoun to basically make it make sense. A third type is to select or highlight some specific part of what they've said and then literally say it back to them. Sometimes kind of contextualizing it. So it was really hard on my family, and your active listening response or restatement would be just saying some part of that. Hard on your family. just kind of selecting it out, excerpting it, and placing it in a statement of your own. And a fourth type is basic summarization. So it was really hard on my family. That statement would be restated back in the summary type, as the active listener may be saying something like, it gave your family a really difficult time. Your family had a really hard time dealing with that. Something like that. That's a restatement, but using your own words completely. Okay? So those four types: literal exact restatement, restatement changing the pronoun, exact restatement of certain parts of what they've said, and then a general summary of what they've said in your own words. And the two types of clarification that you can use is for their sake and for your own sake. Okay, so second part of providing feedback is reflection. This is exactly what we've talked about with attachment, with reflective dialogue. It's trying to hear the inner emotional experience of the other and then verbally expressing it back to them. The example of a speaker saying to you, "It was really hard on my family," would be an example of reflection, would be trying to extract the emotional content of what they've just said. Judging by their facial expression and tone of voice and the words they use, you might say something like, "It seems like that was a really painful experience to you and your family," or "It seems like you really felt scared through that ordeal," something like that. Pick out emotional type of words. And I've given you an example of a sentence starter, right? A reflection starter. "It seems to me that," or it's "you seem to feel," that one's coming next. "You seem to feel this way or that way." It's kind of a guess, an approximation of what the emotional experience of the other is, gives them a chance to correct it if it's not quite right. "No, it wasn't painful that I felt," or it wasn't fear that I felt. It was something like an anger, like I was really angry that this happened to me. Okay, that was an example of how a person might correct my reflection. And at the bottom of reflection is always empathy. Empathy is something that you feel within your own emotional body as a result of what you think the other feels. Okay? If they have a heart-wrenching experience and they describe it to you and you have an empathic reaction or response to that, you actually feel some physical emotional change in your own body. You actually experience emotion as though you were them, to the best of your ability, or sometimes it comes quite naturally. Some people have to practice empathy. Some people have a whole lot of it that they're born with, and you can probably know a little bit about which type you are. But using empathy productively is what the name of the game is with reflection. Okay, validation. I've given you the sentence starter here with validation is "it makes sense to me that." Validation is giving the other person full permission to think and feel and have impressions of their experience exactly as they are. It feels very, very good to be validated. I often think of the Fred Rogers quote, as in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, who said something like, "I don't believe that anyone can grow unless they're loved exactly where they are right now." That is a really good way of thinking about what validation is. I feel seen. I feel like whatever I am and however I've experienced life is okay. I'm not wrong just by being me. I might have ideas that are inaccurate, and you'll meet lots of people who have ideas that aren't quite right. But that me, who I am, isn't wrong. That's what validation gives a person, and it's a really exceptional gift to give someone that, because more people than you might imagine actually have a belief that they're not okay, that something about them is wrong. And A lot of people who have emotional difficulties, and likely a lot of people who are difficult to deal with, have those kinds of inner beliefs. So, and I think I skipped the restatement sampler. So, giving you 3 ways of starting these 3 different types of feedback. So, with restatement, you can say, "What I'm hearing you say is," and then say what you heard them say, and then check in. Is that about right? Gives them a chance to correct. With reflection, "You seem to feel X, Y, and Z," and you can also ask them for corrections. Is that about right? And then with validation, it makes sense to me that. Pointing out to them what you genuinely think makes sense to you. It makes sense to me that you would feel that kind of pain if you and your family went through that ordeal. They may have responded in a way that you felt made it worse, and you're getting to that by by responding appropriately. But in that moment, you can point out to them that if I responded in the way that you did, and if I thought the way that you did about it, it would make sense to me that you would feel what you did. Okay? So, lastly, I'm going to really briefly describe responding appropriately, because next week we're going to go into it in more depth. Basically, responding appropriately serves the purpose of interpreting what you've heard and maybe explaining some aspects of what you think would be helpful for them. This is when you introduce yourself into the conversation. Throughout active listening, you're basically stepping back, taking the other's frame of reference. Responding appropriately is the shift where you actually take your own frame of reference, your own opinions, your own thoughts, your own perspectives, and then reflect those back to them. It can be to interpret what they've said, to help them make meaning of it. It can be to explain things that they might not understand, and that might be the case in educational scenarios, for instance. It serves an orienting purpose. It does so it helps them orient what they've just described to you through your eyes, and it can also help orient you to what your further response is going to be. And I do want to make sure to point out that in some positions it's difficult not to provide appropriate responses without sounding like a know-it-all. And that really goes in with the explaining part of things. Back to my example, if a person who I'm speaking with says it was a really hard time for me and my family, and I respond to them by saying, it makes sense to me you would have felt like that was a hard thing to do. Here's ways that you did it wrong, and you should have done differently. And then it wouldn't have hurt so bad. That would have been a pretty know-it-all and insensitive type of thing to say. However, it may also be true that I see some things that they've made mistakes with and that they don't see it. And it might be my job to help them see that. But approaching it sensitively is sometimes difficult. You can try starting statements with, "I wonder what would happen if this would have been the case or that been the case." But we'll get more into that next week. I want to make sure to distinguish between providing feedback and responding appropriately. I've kind of already talked about it, but feedback, I'm kind of reading off the slides here. Feedback serves to highlight what you're listening to and how you understand it. So it's giving them information to show that you've heard and you're making sense of their information in a certain way. Responding appropriately is actually related to the action that you take as the listener in response to what you've heard and what you've tried to understand as much as possible. Okay, so these, again, responding appropriately includes your own thoughts as the listener, your own thoughts, your own opinions. You become the speaker as opposed to the listener. That's what that transition is. In providing feedback, you're still in the stance of the active listener. So you're still receiving. You're still out of the way. You're still taking their frame of reference. With responding appropriately, that shifts. Okay, it was their turn to speak, and your turn to be the active listener. You're shifting that now, and you're taking the role of the speaker, and hoping that they're taking the role as the active listener. But that's out of your hands. Okay. Really briefly, I want to talk a little bit about phone conversations and how communication plays a part in that. I've given you a list of some ways that in your future professions, phone conversations might serve a really unique and important purpose. I'm not going to go over all of them in detail, but they're kind of self-explanatory. Good ways to reach out to people easily, good ways to quickly relay information about schedule changes or anything like that. And there are some limitations to phone conversations, but there are also some advantages. Um, some advantages are that take you can take a little bit of information and share it to a lot of people really quickly. So phone conversations, especially when they're like recorded calls, you can reach hundreds of people in a very very short amount of time, um, and it's convenient. You don't have to set up an appointment, meet at the same place. We all have phones practically. So, and this is different from text. We'll kind of talk about texting and emailing some other time. But through this is sort of a lot of convenience, basically. And you don't lose all of the nonverbal stuff. You're obviously not sitting across from them, seeing them. You're not present with them. But you're hearing their tone of voice. You're hearing kind of the backstory. You can still be empathic and reflective through phone conversations. There are some limitations, however. We don't see them. We're not right with them. We're not present with them as fully as we might be face to face. There usually is a limitation to the depth of the conversation in phone talks. That's not always the case, but we might not be able to dive as deeply into conversations with people. Some things may be lost through miscommunication and difficulty reading tone of voice. Some people might rely a lot on visual cues, and on the phone they might have a really hard time reading tone of voice and getting appropriate nonverbal signals. It's also in our types of professions can be a problem if the only time we use the phone is to call for a negative reason. So a really important part of what phone conversations will bring to relationships is a balance of making sure that concerns are shared through phone calls, but also positive celebrations are shared through phone calls too. Sometimes it can be really difficult to contact people. They either don't ever pick up their phone, they don't check their voicemail, they don't have voicemail set up, things like that. And it's also, the sound quality is not the same as a live conversation, obviously. So speaking with people that are not native English language speakers, for instance, sometimes is a little more difficult through phone conversation just because it's not clear audio. But those are just a few limitations, and you'll have to decide when it would be most appropriate to say, I think we better meet in person, to discuss this topic, or based on the limitations that you might see in that relationship. I've given a few ideas about how to make effective phone calls in a professional setting. I mentioned a couple of them already about not calling for just negative reasons all the time. Two things I want to point out. Make sure you have a good number for them. And when you have that good number, a number that works, a number that you know will be reliable, make sure you check to see if you're allowed to leave a voicemail with them. Sometimes, especially if you're a therapist, but also if you're talking about things related to their child, and it might be things that they don't want everyone to know, then you'll really need to be careful about what you leave on voicemail, and double check to make sure that you can leave anything on voicemail. Let it be their call. We'll talk about word choice and different things related to maintaining a professional stance in a couple of weeks, but word choice will be really important because phone calls tend to be shorter. Every word has a lot of weight, or can be thought of that way, and the same is true with timing and attention. If your timing is rushed, it gives them the impression likely that you want to just be through with the phone call. If you're not getting to the point, rambling, then they might want to end the phone call as soon as possible too. When we're on the phone talking with people, it's very easy to be distracted. If you're calling from the car, if you're calling with other people around, if you're calling where you're in a place where you're actually around other people that are friends or family of yours, then you're going to be pulled in different directions while you're on the phone. So a good idea when you're making a professional phone call is to treat it like a meeting. Um, Sit down in a place where you'll be doing nothing but speaking on the phone with that person. Eliminate other distractions, turn your TV off, let other people around you know, hey, I'm going to be, out of touch for a few minutes while I'm on the phone. This really does give the important message that you're paying attention. This is part of the pay attention and demonstrate that attention aspects of active listening. You actually have to take action, and you're on your end of the phone to make sure that that's clear, that you're fully present as much as you can be on the phone. Okay, so hopefully this has been a little pretty clear in the 5 elements of active listening that I've described, and then some components about phone calls. Your assignments this week will relate mostly to providing information about phone call examples and things like that. And I want you to try some of the active listening things we talk about, although I'm not asking you to turn in a practice log type thing. Later on, a few weeks from now, we'll be working on communication experiments, and we'll be coming back to active listening, and I will be very specifically asking you to practice and demonstrate that you've practiced these 5 components of active listening. So go ahead and give them a try. Be prepared to be demonstrating them to me later on in the semester. But right now, just give them a try. Experiment with them on your own. Okay, so as always, reach out to me with any questions, especially on Blackboard. I know that sometimes it's a little difficult to navigate Blackboard, but if you have any questions about assignment descriptions or things like that, just let me know. Due dates should all be pretty clear and stuff, so you know how to get in touch with me. Okay?